Basalt columns rise directly out of a shallow Pacific lagoon, stacked log cabin style into walls that reach 8 meters into the sky, some individual stones weighing as much as 50 tons, arranged across nearly 100 artificial islets built entirely on top of a coral reef flat. No modern engineer has ever fully explained how a Pacific island society with no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals managed to quarry, transport, and stack stone at this scale, and the people who actually lived here left behind a local legend involving two sorcerer brothers who supposedly commanded the stones to fly through the air and settle into place on their own. The legend, whatever its actual relationship to the true engineering story, captures something honest about how strange this place still feels to anyone standing among its walls today. Basalt naturally forms in long hexagonal columns that look, when quarried and stacked, remarkably like cut logs, and early European visitors who eventually found this site tucked away on the edge of a small Micronesian island reported true difficulty believing what they were looking at, a stone city built not on solid ground but directly on top of a living reef. Canals running between its islets exactly like a Pacific version of Venice that nobody outside this exact island had ever heard of. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Tonight, though, we go back to the reef. What actually happened at Nan Madol? Who ruled here? Why the stones were quarried from the opposite side of the island rather than somewhere closer, and why this entire remarkable city was eventually abandoned, involves a centralized dynasty powerful enough to command labor across an entire island, a violent overthrow remembered in detail through oral tradition passed down for centuries before anyone wrote it down, and a modern conservation crisis quietly threatening to swallow the ruins from below. Tonight we trace the full arc of this place, and by the end you will understand exactly what it took to raise a city of stone directly out of the sea, using nothing but human labor, patient engineering, and, if the local legend carries any truth at all, something the builders themselves may have really believed was closer to magic. Consider what it actually took to keep a story like this alive for so long without ever writing it down. No stone here carries an inscription. No king left behind a proclamation. Everything historians and archaeologists know about who ruled this place, why it was built, and why it fell, survives because generation after generation of Pohnpeian storytellers chose to keep repeating it, carefully enough that when outside researchers finally arrived with shovels and notebooks centuries later, the physical evidence they dug up matched the oral history almost point for point. That correspondence alone should tell you something about how seriously this story deserves to be taken tonight. Nan Madol sits off the southeastern coast of Pohnpei, the largest island in what is now the Federated States of Micronesia, a small volcanic island rising from the western Pacific roughly halfway between Hawaii and the Philippines, its interior covered in dense rainforest and its coastline fringed by mangrove swamp and coral reef that made the location Nan Madol occupies both strategically defensible and, from an engineering standpoint, unusual as a place to build anything at all. Pohnpei's own volcanic origin gave the island its rugged mountainous interior, the highest peaks rising well over 700 meters above sea level and capturing enough rainfall to make Pohnpei one of the wettest inhabited places anywhere on Earth, a climate that fed the dense forest cover still visible across most of the island's interior today and that also, less obviously but just as importantly, fed the network of rivers and streams that early Pohnpeian communities depended on for fresh water even while building their ceremonial capital directly out on the saltwater reef a short distance offshore. The site itself consists of 92 artificial islets constructed directly on top of the reef flat, separated by a network of tidal canals that early visitors consistently compared to Venice, each islet built by first laying down a foundation of coral boulders and rubble to raise the surface above the tide line. then constructing walls and platforms on top using the distinctive columnar basalt that gives the entire site its unmistakable visual character, a stone that forms naturally when volcanic lava cools slowly enough to crystallize into long, straight-edged hexagonal or pentagonal columns rather than the more irregular shapes most volcanic rock typically produces. Construction at Nan Madol appears, based on radiocarbon dating and archaeological sequencing conducted across multiple research campaigns, to have unfolded gradually across several centuries, with the earliest activity at the site potentially dating back as far as the 1st century of the Common Era. Though the monumental basalt construction that defines the site's most recognizable structures today likely developed much later, reaching its full architectural expression sometime between the 12th and 17th centuries, a building program stretched across generations rather than the achievement of any single reign or single burst of construction activity. The total volume of basalt moved to construct the site represents one of the more actually staggering statistics in all of Pacific archaeology, with researchers estimating the complete complex incorporates somewhere in the range of 750,000 metric tons of stone, an amount comparable to the material used in some of the largest monumental construction projects anywhere in the ancient world, achieved by a Pacific island society whose total population never likely exceeded a modest few tens of thousands of people spread across the entire island of Pohnpei, a scale of labor mobilization that becomes only more impressive the more closely researchers examine exactly how this specific society organized itself to accomplish it. The basalt columns used throughout Nan Madol were not quarried from anywhere near the construction site itself, but transported from sources scattered around Pohnpei's interior and coastline, with the largest and most heavily used quarry sites located a considerable distance away, requiring the stone to travel by water once it had been extracted. A logistical challenge that Pacific Island builders solved without any of the technologies, wheeled carts, draft animals, iron tools, that comparable monumental construction projects elsewhere in the ancient world typically relied upon. Geologists working at the primary quarry sites have documented tool marks and partially worked columns left behind exactly where ancient workers abandoned them, evidence that offers a rare direct window into the actual quarrying process itself. Stone workers apparently exploiting the natural fracture lines already present within the columnar basalt formation to split individual columns free from the surrounding rock face using little more than fire, water, and simple hand tools, a technique that required patience and accumulated practical knowledge passed down through generations of quarry workers rather than any specialized technology beyond what Pohnpeian craftspeople had already developed and refined over considerable time. The construction technique visible in the site's surviving walls, known as header and stretcher stacking, alternates the orientation of successive courses of columnar basalt, some columns laid lengthwise along the wall's direction and others laid crosswise perpendicular to it, a method that interlocks each course with the one beneath it and produces walls with structural stability despite using no mortar or binding material whatsoever, the sheer weight and precise interlocking geometry of the stacked columns providing all the stability the finished structure required. Modern engineers and archaeologists who have studied the construction methods used at Nan Madol have proposed several complementary explanations for how the builders actually transported columns weighing up to 50 tons from quarry sites to the construction location, the most widely accepted theory involving lashed log rafts that could float the heavy stone columns across open water during high tide, when the additional depth would have made maneuvering laden rafts through the shallow reef channels notably more practical, a technique that would have required careful coordination with tidal cycles and a true sophisticated understanding of how to manage buoyancy and balance while moving objects this heavy across open water using entirely human-powered watercraft. An alternative and complementary theory proposes that some columns may have been moved using a combination of wooden rollers and sledges across sections of reef exposed at low tide, dragged short distances by large coordinated groups of laborers before being transferred back to raft transport for the deeper water crossings a full journey from quarry to construction site would have required. A hybrid approach that would have let builders exploit whichever method best suited each specific segment of a given column's total journey, and one that finds some indirect support in the specific placement of certain quarry sites relative to the tidal channels that would have made this kind of mixed land and water transport practical. Local Pohnpeian oral tradition, preserved and transmitted across many generations independent of any written record, describes the stones as having flown to their positions under their own power, directed by the magical abilities of two legendary brothers named Olisipa and Olasopa, who according to this tradition arrived at Pohnpei from a foreign land in search of a place to build an altar for worship, a story that, whatever its literal historical accuracy, preserves genuine cultural memory of the site's construction as an achievement considered remarkable enough by the people who witnessed or inherited stories about it that ordinary human explanation seemed, to many tellers of the tale across many generations, really insufficient to account for what had actually been accomplished. Olisipa and Olasopa are remembered in some versions of the tradition as having first attempted their construction project at a different, less suitable location before eventually settling on the specific reef flat where Nan Madol now stands, a detail that some researchers have suggested may preserve genuine memory of an actual early, unsuccessful attempt at monumental construction elsewhere on Pohnpei before builders learned enough from that earlier effort to succeed at the site's eventual permanent location, though this interpretation remains speculative without direct archaeological confirmation of any comparable earlier construction attempt anywhere else on the island. The political structure that organized and directed this massive construction effort centered on the Sorcerer dynasty, a centralized ruling lineage that, according to Pohnpeian oral tradition supported by archaeological evidence, unified political control over the entire island of Pohnpei under a single line of rulers for the first time in the island's history, establishing Nan Madol as their ceremonial and administrative capital and using the site's monumental architecture to project and reinforce their own authority over the wider island population. Oral tradition preserves the names and, in some accounts, the specific personalities and deeds of individual Sorcerer rulers across the dynasty's roughly 17 generations of recorded succession, a genealogical depth that suggests a formal, deliberately maintained oral historical tradition comparable in its own way to the king lists and dynastic records that written civilizations elsewhere in the ancient world kept on stone or clay, transmitted instead through trained memory and structured storytelling rather than any physical inscription, yet apparently precise enough to preserve a coherent and internally consistent sequence of rulers across many centuries of transmission. Prior to the Sorcerer period, Pohnpei's political organization appears to have been considerably more fragmented, divided among numerous smaller chiefdoms without any single overarching authority, and the Sorcerer achievement in consolidating this fragmented political landscape into a unified island-wide state represents, by the standards of Pacific Island political history more broadly, a significant and genuinely unusual level of centralized state formation, comparable in its ambition to political consolidation projects documented in far larger and more populous regions of the world. Oral tradition attributes this initial consolidation to the founding generation of the Sorcerer line, describing a gradual process of alliance building, strategic marriage, and, in some versions of the story, outright conquest of rival chiefdoms across multiple generations before the dynasty achieved the kind of complete island-wide authority later remembered as characteristic of Sorcerer rule at its height, a founding narrative that, whatever its precise historical accuracy in every specific detail, consistently frames political unification as a gradual accomplished project rather than a single decisive founding event. The Sorcerer rulers appear to have maintained their authority through a combination of religious legitimacy, claiming descent from or special relationship with important deities, and a true sophisticated tribute system that required subject populations across Pohnpei to regularly deliver food and other resources to Nan Madol. A system oral tradition remembers as growing increasingly harsh and increasingly demanding across the later generations of Sorcerer rule, with some accounts describing tribute requirements calculated with such precise and exacting standards that failure to meet them precisely could result in serious punishment for the offending community. One frequently repeated element of this tradition describes tribute requirements measured with such exacting precision that a community's delivered goods might be rejected and the community punished if a single item fell even slightly short of the expected standard, a level of administrative exactitude that, whether or not every specific detail of this tradition reflects literal historical fact, communicates something genuine about how oral memory came to characterize the later sorcerer period. As a system of control that had drifted from legitimate authority into something much closer to arbitrary, exploitative demand. Nan Madol itself functioned under this system not as an ordinary residential settlement but as a really specialized ceremonial and administrative center, its resident population likely consisting primarily of the ruling elite, priests, and the skilled craftspeople and laborers necessary to maintain the site's religious and political functions, while the great majority of Pohnpei's actual population continued living in more conventional agricultural settlements scattered across the islands. Interior and coastline, traveling to Nan Madol periodically for tribute delivery, religious ceremony, or formal audience with sorcerer authority rather than residing there permanently as part of daily life. This division between a specialized ceremonial capital and a dispersed agricultural population living elsewhere across the island recurs across many comparable early state societies documented around the world, a pattern reflecting the practical reality that monumental ceremonial centers, however architecturally impressive, rarely functioned as self-sufficient population centers capable of feeding and sustaining large permanent resident populations, depending instead on precisely the kind of tribute and supply system the sorcerer dynasty built to keep its ceremonial capital functioning, while the actual agricultural labor that sustained the wider island economy continued elsewhere, largely out of sight of the monumental architecture that has come to define popular understanding of the period. Among the roughly 100 individual islets that make up Nan Madol, one structure stands out as both the largest and the most architecturally significant, Nandawas, a massive mortuary complex built to house the tombs of sorcerer rulers and their close relatives, its outer walls rising as high as 8 meters and enclosing a central courtyard where the actual burial crypts were constructed, the entire structure representing the single largest concentration of stacked basalt anywhere across the wider site. The islet's overall footprint covers an area larger than a modern soccer field, and the sheer volume of stone incorporated into its walls alone represents a substantial fraction of the total basalt tonnage moved across the entire multi-century construction program, a concentration of resources and labor that reflects exactly how central royal burial and ancestor veneration were to the sorcerer political and religious system, the dynasty apparently investing more coordinated construction effort into properly housing its own dead than into almost any other single structure across the wider ceremonial capital. The walls of Nandawas incorporate some of the largest individual basalt columns used anywhere at Nan Madol, several exceeding 5 meters in length and requiring the kind of careful, coordinated transport and lifting effort that modern engineers examining the structure have found difficult to fully reconstruct, since even understanding the basic mechanics of how workers using no metal tools and no mechanical lifting devices maneuvered stones this large into precise position atop walls already several meters high requires accepting a level of practical engineering sophistication that written historical sources never had occasion to document directly. Researchers have proposed that builders likely used earthen ramps built up temporarily against the growing wall, gradually raised in height as construction progressed, allowing workers to drag or roll the heaviest columns up a manageable gradient to reach their final resting position rather than attempting to lift them vertically using anything resembling a crane or pulley system, a technique documented at comparable ancient monumental construction sites elsewhere in the world and one that would have required the ramps themselves to be dismantled and removed once construction reached its final height, leaving behind no direct physical evidence of the temporary earthworks beyond whatever subtle soil disturbance patterns careful excavation immediately surrounding the completed walls might still reveal. Excavation within Nandawas and comparable mortuary structures at the site has recovered human remains along with grave goods including shell ornaments, stone tools, and other items interpreted as burial offerings appropriate to the elevated social status of the individuals interred there. Evidence consistent with oral tradition's consistent description of Nandawas specifically as the resting place reserved for sorcerer rulers themselves rather than a burial ground available to the wider Pohnpeian population. The specific arrangement of burial crypts within the central courtyard also suggests a deliberate hierarchy of placement, certain positions apparently reserved for particular categories of sorcerer family members based on their rank or relationship to the ruling line. A spatial organization that researchers have interpreted as physically encoding the same kind of formal social hierarchy that governed the living sorcerer court, extended even into how the dynasty's dead were arranged relative to one another within their shared mortuary complex. The exact religious and ceremonial practices associated with Nandawas and the wider mortuary function of this section of Madol remain only partially reconstructed through the combination of archaeological evidence and oral tradition available to researchers, though what does survive suggests a genuinely elaborate set of funerary customs surrounding sorcerer death and burial, practices that reinforced the ruling dynasty's claimed connection to sacred and ancestral authority through the careful, monumental treatment given to the physical remains of deceased rulers, a treatment considerably more elaborate than anything documented for ordinary Pohnpeian burial practice during the same historical period. Religious practice at Madol during the sorcerer period appears to have centered significantly on the veneration of a sacred eel, an animal that held true spiritual importance within traditional Pohnpeian belief systems, and that structures at the site, including a dedicated eel sanctuary still recognized in local tradition today, were apparently built specifically to honor a religious practice connecting the site's monumental stone architecture to an older and more widely shared body of Pohnpeian spiritual belief that predates the sorcerer dynasty's own political and religious innovations. This eel veneration tradition connects Madol to a wider pattern of eel worship documented across many other Pacific Island cultures, suggesting the sorcerer dynasty did not invent this particular religious practice from nothing, but rather absorbed and monumentalized an already established regional spiritual tradition into their own newly centralized political and ceremonial system. A pattern of religious continuity layered beneath political innovation that recurs across many comparable historical examples of centralized states emerging from previously more fragmented cultural landscapes elsewhere in the ancient world. Priests attached to the sorcerer ceremonial system occupied a true important position within the wider social hierarchy that organized life at Madol, serving as intermediaries between the ruling dynasty and the spiritual authorities the sorcerers claimed connection to. And archaeological evidence from exact structures interpreted as priestly residences or ceremonial preparation areas suggests a resident religious specialist class distinct from both the ruling elite and the ordinary laborers who maintained the site's more practical daily functions. These religious specialists likely maintained and transmitted much of the sacred knowledge associated with the eel veneration tradition and other sorcerer-era ceremonial practice, a role that positioned the priesthood as genuine custodians of specialized religious information that ordinary Pohnpeians outside this specialist class would not necessarily have possessed in equivalent detail. A pattern of concentrated religious knowledge among a dedicated priestly class that finds broad parallel in comparable ceremonial and religious systems documented across many other ancient societies that similarly separated specialized religious authority from both political rule and ordinary daily labor. Ritual feasting appears to have played a significant role in the ceremonial life organized around Madol, with archaeological evidence including concentrations of food remains and specialized cooking and food preparation areas found at several locations across the site suggesting large-scale communal meals connected to religious observance, political tribute ceremony, or both simultaneously, a practice that would have reinforced the sorcerer dynasty's authority through visible demonstration of the ruler's capacity to provide abundant food for large gathered populations, a form of political theater built around hospitality and material generosity that recurs across many traditional Pacific Island political systems documented in far more recent historical periods. Analysis of food remains recovered from these feasting contexts has identified a diet drawing on marine resources, including fish and shellfish harvested directly from the surrounding reef, alongside terrestrial foods including breadfruit, taro, and pork, evidence of a varied ceremonial cuisine that drew on both the marine environment immediately surrounding Madol itself and the agricultural resources of Pohnpei's wider interior, requiring coordinated supply lines bringing food from across the island specifically to support the large gatherings that periodic ceremonial feasting apparently required. The specific religious cosmology that underpins sorcerer authority, connecting the ruling dynasty to divine or ancestral sanction for their political power, survives today primarily through oral tradition rather than any written religious text, meaning much of what modern researchers understand about the actual theological content of sorcerer-era religious belief depends substantially on how faithfully this oral tradition preserved really ancient religious concepts across the intervening centuries versus how much later reinterpretation and elaboration may have shaped the exact stories now told about the site's original religious significance. Comparative work with other Micronesian and wider Pacific religious traditions has helped researchers place sorcerer-era Pohnpeian cosmology within a broader regional context, identifying shared concepts around ancestral spirits, sacred natural features, and the specific relationship between chiefly authority and spiritual legitimacy that recur across multiple island cultures throughout the Western Pacific, suggesting the sorcerer religious system, whatever its own particular innovations, drew on a shared underlying regional religious framework rather than developing in complete isolation from the wider currents of Pacific Island belief and practice. Sorcerer rule over Pohnpei, remembered by oral tradition as becoming increasingly harsh and increasingly exploitative across its later generations, eventually collapsed following what tradition describes as an invasion led by a figure named Islets, remembered in Pohnpeian oral history as a warrior of semi-divine origin, sometimes described as a descendant of the thunder god, who arrived at Pohnpei with a substantial force of warriors specifically to overthrow the last sorcerer ruler and end what tradition consistently characterizes as a period of tyrannical, excessive demand placed on the island's ordinary population. Different versions of the Islets story preserved across various Pohnpeian communities disagree on certain specific details, some describing his arrival as motivated primarily by a personal vision or divine calling, others emphasizing more concrete grievances against sorcerer mistreatment of his own family or homeland. A pattern of variation between different oral tellings of the same core historical event that researchers studying the tradition treat not as evidence of unreliability but as the ordinary, expected texture of oral history maintained across many generations and many separate storytelling lineages, each community's version emphasizing the details most meaningful to its own particular ancestral connection to the events described. The details of this conquest, as preserved through oral tradition, describe a military campaign that ultimately succeeded in defeating sorcerer forces and ending the dynasty's centralized control over the entire island, though the precise historical accuracy of specific details within this oral account, the exact identity and origin of Islets, the precise military tactics involved, the exact timeline of events, remains difficult for modern historians to verify independently given the absence of any written record contemporary with the events themselves. Following the sorcerer dynasty's fall, Pohnpei's political organization shifted decisively away from the centralized, island-wide authority the sorcerers had established, reorganizing instead into a system of multiple independent chiefdoms, each governed by its own paramount chief known as a non-warki, a decentralized political structure that, remarkably, persists in modified form on Pohnpei even today, meaning the political transformation triggered by Islets' conquest established a governance pattern that has outlasted the centralized sorcerer system it originally replaced by a considerably longer span of time than the sorcerer dynasty itself ever actually held power. The specific non-warki title system that emerged following this transition organized Pohnpei into distinct chiefdoms, each with its own internal hierarchy of titled positions that individuals could work their way up through over the course of a lifetime, a system notably more distributed and more participatory in its structure than the single, centralized Sorcerer dynasty had ever been, and one that many contemporary Pohnpeians point to directly as the living political legacy of Isoclical's original conquest, a governance philosophy explicitly organized around avoiding the concentration of unchecked authority that oral tradition remembers as having corrupted the later generations of Sorcerer rule. Isoclical himself, according to tradition, established his own new political authority following his victory, though the political system he founded appears to have differed fundamentally from the centralized Sorcerer model, distributing authority across the newly established non-Morki system rather than concentrating it within a single ruling lineage governing the entire island from one ceremonial capital, a deliberate political choice that oral tradition sometimes frames as a direct, corrective response to the abuses of centralized Sorcerer authority that had originally motivated Isoclical's invasion in the first place. Nan Madol's role and importance following the Sorcerer dynasty's collapse appears to have diminished gradually rather than ending abruptly, the site continuing to serve some ceremonial and political functions under the new non-Morki system for a period afterward, though without the same centralized, island-wide administrative importance it had held during the height of Sorcerer rule. A pattern of gradual decline in active use that eventually resulted in the site's substantial abandonment by the time European visitors first documented it in the 19th century. Isoclical himself, according to several versions of the tradition, is remembered as having initially attempted to continue using Nan Madol in some capacity following his conquest, before ultimately relocating the actual center of his own authority elsewhere on the island, a detail that, if accurate, suggests the site's gradual abandonment began not through simple neglect but through a deliberate early decision by the new political order to distance itself symbolically from the specific ceremonial capital most closely associated with the deposed Sorcerer dynasty's memory. The exact timeline and precise reasons behind Nan Madol's transition from active political and religious center to largely abandoned ruin remain incompletely understood, with the decentralized non-Morki system that replaced Sorcerer rule apparently having less practical need for a single, centralized ceremonial capital of this scale. Individual chiefdoms instead developing their own more localized centers of political and religious authority scattered across different parts of the island, rather than continuing to concentrate ceremonial activity at the single former Sorcerer capital. Some researchers have also proposed that the practical logistical burden of maintaining Nan Madol itself, a site requiring continuous coordinated labor investment simply to keep its structures in good repair against the constant erosive pressure of its own tidal, coastal environment, may have become considerably harder to sustain once the centralized tribute and labor mobilization system that had originally supported its construction and maintenance was no longer available under the new, more distributed non-Morki political order, a practical maintenance challenge distinct from but likely compounding the more straightforward political explanation for the site's gradual decline in active use. Some sections of Nan Madol appear to have retained ceremonial and spiritual significance for Pohnpeian communities even after the site's broader political importance had substantially declined, oral tradition and later ethnographic documentation both suggesting that certain structures, particularly those connected to the eel veneration and other religious practices predating the Sorcerer dynasty itself, continued receiving at least occasional ceremonial attention and respect from local communities even as the site's grander monumental structures gradually fell into disuse and disrepair. This gradual, partial decline rather than sudden total abandonment helps explain why Pohnpeian oral tradition managed to preserve such actually detailed memory of the site's original purpose and history across the centuries, separating the Sorcerer dynasty's fall from the site's eventual documentation by outside researchers, since communities maintaining even occasional ceremonial connection to specific structures within the wider ruins would have had ongoing practical reason to keep transmitting accurate knowledge about what those structures actually represented, rather than the kind of complete cultural disconnection that, at many other archaeological sites around the world, has left later researchers working entirely without benefit of any surviving local historical memory to guide their interpretation. This continuity of connection also meant that when 19th and early 20th century outside researchers first began seriously documenting the site, they arrived to find not a mute ruin requiring pure archaeological guesswork to interpret, but a place local communities could still explain in considerable narrative and functional detail. Information that shaped and much improved the quality of early documentation efforts in ways that purely archaeological excavation, however careful, could never have achieved, working in isolation from this parallel body of living traditional knowledge. European contact with Pohnpei and eventual documentation of Nan Madol developed gradually across the 18th and 19th centuries, with Spanish explorers making some of the earliest recorded European visits to the wider Caroline Islands region during the Spanish colonial period. Though detailed written documentation specifically describing Nan Madol's ruins did not begin appearing in substantial form until American and European whaling ships, missionaries, and eventually dedicated scientific expeditions increasingly visited Pohnpei across the 19th century. Whaling crews operating across the wider Pacific during the 19th century represented one of the earliest and most consistent sources of outside contact with Pohnpei specifically, ships regularly stopping to resupply fresh water and provisions, and several surviving whaling logs and crew memoirs from this period include brief but genuinely startled descriptions of stumbling upon the ruined stone city, accounts that, while rarely detailed enough to constitute serious documentation in their own right, nonetheless represent some of the earliest written evidence confirming that outside visitors had begun encountering Nan Madol well before any formal scientific expedition arrived to study it properly. These early written accounts consistently describe visitors experiencing genuine astonishment upon encountering the ruins directly, several 19th century observers explicitly comparing the site's network of stone-walled islets and connecting tidal canals to Venice, a comparison that, while imperfect given the very different construction materials, techniques, and cultural context involved, captures something true about the exact visual and spatial impression Nan Madol makes on visitors. Encountering its distinctive combination of monumental stone architecture and water-based urban layout for the first time. Several of these early 19th century accounts also record local Pohnpeian testimony about the site's history and significance, providing outside researchers with an early, if fragmentary, window into the oral tradition that would later prove so valuable to systematic archaeological interpretation, though these early written summaries, filtered through visitors with limited language ability and limited cultural context, inevitably captured only a partial and sometimes distorted version of the notably richer and more detailed tradition that formal ethnographic research would eventually document with far greater care and precision in the following century. Systematic scientific investigation of the site began in earnest during the early 20th century, with German researchers, including Paul Hambruch, conducting some of the first detailed archaeological documentation and ethnographic research during Germany's period of colonial administration over Pohnpei following the Spanish-American War, work that, alongside subsequent Japanese colonial-era research conducted after Germany's own colonial administration ended following the First World War, established much of the foundational archaeological documentation that later researchers would continue building upon across the following decades. Hambruch's expedition, sponsored by German colonial and scientific institutions eager to document the various island territories Germany had acquired across Micronesia, produced detailed maps, photographs, and written descriptions that remain valuable reference material for researchers today. Even as later generations of scholars have worked to reassess this early colonial-era documentation with appropriate critical attention to the specific political and cultural assumptions that shaped how Hambruch and his contemporaries originally interpreted what they observed at the site. American researchers conducted additional significant archaeological work at the site following the Second World War, once Pohnpei came under American administration as part of the wider trust territory of the Pacific Islands, this later research phase benefiting from increasingly sophisticated archaeological methodology and, critically, From closer collaboration with local Pohnpeian communities whose oral tradition and traditional knowledge of the site provided context and interpretive guidance that purely external archaeological analysis alone could not have supplied, a collaborative research model that has continued developing and strengthening across subsequent decades of ongoing investigation at the site. The transition from purely extractive colonial-era research toward this more true collaborative model mirrors a broader shift documented across archaeological practice at indigenous heritage sites worldwide during the second half of the 20th century, researchers increasingly recognizing that meaningful, accurate interpretation of sites like Madol required treating descendant communities as genuine partners and knowledge holders rather than simply as local informants providing raw material for outside scholars to interpret according to their own external academic frameworks alone. Radiocarbon dating conducted across multiple research campaigns throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries has helped establish a considerably more precise chronological framework for the site's construction than early researchers working purely from oral tradition and comparative architectural analysis were able to achieve, confirming that construction activities spanned several centuries rather than representing a single concentrated building campaign, and helping researchers distinguish between the site's earlier, less monumental construction phases and the later periods of intensive basalt column construction that produced the site's most recognizable and most visually impressive surviving structures. Charcoal and organic material recovered from carefully excavated foundation layers beneath specific islets have provided the primary raw material for this dating work. Samples collected from undisturbed contexts deep within the artificial fill used to raise each islet above the tide line, evidence that, combined with the layered stratigraphy visible where researchers have been able to excavate carefully without disturbing the overlying stone architecture, allows a detailed reconstruction of which sections of the wider site were built earliest and which represent later additions to an already substantial existing ceremonial complex. Modern archaeological survey techniques, including increasingly detailed mapping of the site's full extent and careful documentation of previously unrecorded structures scattered across less accessible sections of the wider reef flat, have continued refining researchers' understanding of Madol's full scale and complexity, revealing that the site's total footprint and total construction volume likely exceeds what earlier, less systematic survey work had initially documented, suggesting the full history of construction and use at the site remains, even after more than a century of dedicated research attention, still not completely mapped or fully understood. These continuing survey efforts have proven particularly valuable for identifying smaller, less visually dramatic structures that earlier researchers, understandably drawn to the site's most monumental and most photogenic sections, had previously overlooked or underdocumented. Evidence suggesting the full ceremonial complex likely supported a far wider range of daily practical activities beyond the elite ceremonial and mortuary functions that dominate popular understanding of the site. Ordinary craft production, food storage, and residential activity that supported the ceremonial elite's own presence at the site, but that has left behind much less dramatic and considerably harder to identify physical evidence than the towering basalt walls that naturally draw most visitor and researcher attention first. Geological analysis of the basalt used throughout the site has allowed researchers to trace quarry sources with considerable precision, matching the distinctive mineral composition of stone found in different sections of Madol's walls back to specific quarry locations elsewhere on Pohnpei, work that has helped confirm and refine theories about exactly how far the heaviest columns needed to travel and exactly which transport routes across the surrounding reef and coastline the ancient builders most likely used to move this material from quarry to construction site. This kind of precise geological sourcing work has also allowed researchers to identify which sections of the wider ceremonial complex drew stone from which specific quarries, revealing patterns that may reflect either straightforward logistical convenience, builders naturally favoring whichever quarry sat closest to a given construction phase, or potentially more deliberate symbolic choices connecting particular structures to particular quarry sites that themselves may have carried their own specific cultural or religious significance within the broader Pohnpeian landscape, a possibility that remains an active area of ongoing research rather than a settled conclusion. This ongoing scientific work has consistently reinforced rather than undermined the basic outline of Nan Madol's history that Pohnpeian oral tradition had already preserved independently for centuries before formal archaeological investigation began. A pattern of convergence between traditional knowledge and scientific evidence that researchers working at the site have increasingly come to treat as a methodological asset, using oral tradition not merely as interesting supplementary color but as a legitimate primary source deserving the same careful, critical evaluation that archaeologists apply to physical evidence recovered directly from the ground. Nan Madol received formal recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2016, becoming the first site in the Federated States of Micronesia to receive this international designation. An honor that reflected both the site's genuine global archaeological significance and the sustained advocacy work Pohnpeian and wider Micronesian heritage authorities had invested in bringing international attention to a site that, despite its remarkable scale and significance, remained less widely known internationally than comparable monumental archaeological sites in more heavily visited regions of the world. The nomination process itself required years of preparation, Pohnpeian and national Micronesian heritage officials working alongside international archaeological consultants to document the site's significance according to UNESCO's own formal evaluative criteria, a bureaucratic undertaking far more demanding than simply pointing to the ruins' obvious scale and mystery, requiring detailed conservation planning, boundary mapping, and documented evidence of sustained institutional capacity to manage and protect the site going forward. Precisely the kind of administrative infrastructure that a small island nation with genuinely limited resources found challenging to assemble even while thoroughly deserving the international recognition the designation ultimately provided. This same UNESCO designation, notably, placed Nan Madol simultaneously on the list of World Heritage in Danger, an unusual and immediately urgent classification reflecting the true serious conservation threats facing the site, primarily the encroachment of mangrove vegetation whose root systems have been gradually infiltrating and physically destabilizing sections of the ancient basalt walls, along with broader concerns about sea level rise and coastal erosion that, given the site's exact low-lying position directly on a reef flat barely above current sea level, pose a really existential long-term threat to the ruins' continued physical survival. Being placed on both lists simultaneously, formal World Heritage recognition and the urgent danger classification arriving together rather than the more typical pattern of danger status following years or decades after initial inscription, reflected the specific severity of the conservation situation Pohnpeian and international heritage officials already recognized at the time of nomination. A deliberate decision to be transparent from the outset about the urgent condition of the site rather than waiting for future deterioration to force the issue at some later date. The mangrove encroachment problem specifically has intensified considerably in recent decades, vegetation growing directly through and around structures that had previously remained relatively clear. Root systems working into gaps between stacked basalt columns in a slow but destructive process that conservation researchers have identified as one of the most immediate and most difficult challenges facing ongoing preservation efforts, requiring careful vegetation management that must balance active conservation intervention against respect for a site whose surrounding natural environment itself carries true ecological and, in some cases, cultural significance for local Pohnpeian communities. Addressing these conservation challenges requires resources and technical expertise that Pohnpei's own limited local infrastructure struggles to fully provide independently, meaning ongoing preservation work at Nan Madol depends substantially on continued international collaboration and funding support. A genuinely urgent conservation situation that UNESCO's World Heritage in Danger designation was specifically designed to help address by drawing sustained international attention and resources towards sites facing exactly this kind of serious, time-sensitive preservation crisis before the damage already underway becomes irreversible. International conservation organizations working alongside Pohnpeian heritage authorities have begun piloting targeted vegetation removal and structural stabilization projects at specific priority sections of the site. Work that requires careful specialist training, since removing established mangrove root systems without further damaging the ancient basalt walls those roots have already partially infiltrated demands a level of technical precision notably beyond what standard vegetation clearance techniques used in other contexts could safely provide, meaning conservation teams have had to develop specialized methods specifically calibrated to Nan Madol's own particular combination of ancient dry stone construction and aggressive tropical plant growth. Nan Madol continues to hold spiritual and cultural significance for many Pohnpeian communities today, beyond its status as an archaeological curiosity or tourist destination, with local tradition maintaining that the site remains inhabited by powerful spirits connected to its history as the sorcerer ceremonial capital, a belief that shapes how many Pohnpeians, including some professional researchers working at the site themselves, approach the ruins with caution and ritual respect rather than purely as a straightforward object of scientific study. Visitors and researchers alike are often advised by local guides to observe specific protocols before entering certain sections of the site, including verbal acknowledgement or small offerings intended to request permission from the resident spirits associated with particular structures, a practice that outside researchers visiting the site have increasingly adopted into their own standard fieldwork routine, not merely as a courtesy to local hosts but as a genuine acknowledgement that the site carries a living significance that predates and, in the view of many Pohnpeians, considerably outweighs its status as a subject of academic archaeological interest. Access to certain sections of the site remains restricted or requires ritual protocol according to local custom, reflecting the fact that Nan Madol functions, for many Pohnpeian people, not simply as a historical relic disconnected from contemporary life but as a living component of ongoing cultural and spiritual tradition, a status that international heritage organizations and visiting researchers have increasingly worked to respect and accommodate within their own conservation and research planning, rather than treating local spiritual belief as an obstacle to purely scientific investigation of the site. Some specific structures within the wider complex remain effectively off-limits to casual visitation entirely, reserved for particular families or lineages who maintain traditional custodial responsibility over those specific sections passed down through generations, a pattern of distributed, family-based stewardship over different portions of the wider site that predates and continues to operate alongside the more formal, centralized heritage management structures that national and international conservation bodies have established in more recent decades. Contemporary Pohnpeian oral tradition surrounding Nan Madol continues to be actively maintained and transmitted across generations, with knowledge holders within specific families and communities serving as recognized authorities on particular aspects of the site's traditional history, a living oral tradition that exists alongside and in ongoing dialogue with the accumulating body of formal archaeological research, each source of knowledge periodically confirming, complicating, or adding nuance to the other in ways that the wider research community now generally regards as mutually enriching rather than as competing or contradictory approaches to understanding the same underlying history. Pohnpeian schools and community education programs have increasingly incorporated formal instruction about Nan Madol's history into their own curricula in recent decades, drawing on both documented archaeological findings and locally maintained oral tradition. An educational effort aimed specifically at ensuring younger generations of Pohnpeians grow up with genuine familiarity and connection to the site's history, rather than allowing that knowledge to become the exclusive domain of a shrinking number of elder knowledge holders and specialist researchers. This ongoing living relationship between Nan Madol and contemporary Pohnpeian culture distinguishes the site in important ways from many other major archaeological ruins around the world where the descendant communities of the original builders have been displaced, culturally disconnected, or otherwise separated from active, ongoing relationship with their own ancestral heritage sites. Nan Madol instead remaining true woven into the contemporary cultural and spiritual life of the very communities most directly descended from the people who originally built and used it centuries ago. Visiting Nan Madol today typically requires arriving by boat, navigating through the same tidal canals that once connected the site's 92 islets during its active period of use, the exact physical experience of approaching the ruins from the water, rather than by any land-based route, preserving something really close to how the site's original builders and residents would have actually experienced arriving at and moving through this place centuries ago. Local boat operators who ferry visitors to the site today are frequently descended from families with generations of accumulated knowledge about the site's tidal patterns, safe channels, and specific historical significance of individual structures, a form of practical, living expertise that supplements and enriches whatever formal archaeological interpretation official signage or guidebooks might otherwise provide, visitors often coming away with a much richer understanding of the site through informal conversation with their boat operator than through any written material alone could have conveyed. The basalt walls, weathered by centuries of tropical exposure and increasingly interwoven with the encroaching mangrove roots that pose such true conservation concern, nonetheless retain a visual power that photographs alone struggle to fully capture. The sheer scale of individual columns, some longer than a person is tall, stacked with a precision that remains impressive, even accounting for the intervening centuries of gradual settling and weathering that any monumental stone structure this old inevitably experiences. Sunlight moving across these walls throughout the day produces sharply changing shadow patterns along each column's hexagonal edges, the naturally geometric shape of the stone catching morning and afternoon light in ways that emphasize the sheer visual regularity of the construction, an effect that likely struck the site's original builders and visitors with much the same visual force it produces for anyone standing among these walls today, centuries after the last sorcerer ceremony was ever performed within them. Nandawas, the largest and most architecturally significant structure at the site, presents visitors today with walls still standing tall enough to convey something of their original imposing scale. The interior courtyard where sorcerer royal burials once took place now open to the sky. Tropical vegetation growing within spaces that once held some of the most spiritually and politically significant activity anywhere on Pohnpei, a juxtaposition of monumental human achievement and patient, natural reclamation that visitors consistently describe as producing a powerful emotional and atmospheric effect. The tidal rhythm that governs the site continues shaping the visitor experience much as it once shaped the original construction and daily use of the site itself. Certain canals and approaches only fully navigable during specific tidal windows, meaning a visit to Nan Madol requires the same kind of practical accommodation to the rhythm of the surrounding sea that its original builders would have needed to master centuries ago, a small but genuine point of continuity connecting modern visitors to the daily practical reality of life at this remarkable waterbound stone city during its own active period of use and construction. Visitors who time their arrival correctly can watch the canals themselves transform across a single day, exposed mudflat and rock at low tide giving way to navigable channels as the water rises, a direct daily demonstration of exactly the environmental rhythm the original builders would have needed to understand and work around, not as abstract historical knowledge but as the same immediate, practical fact of daily life it always was for anyone actually living and working at this specific place. The broader significance of Nan Madol within the wider history of Pacific Island civilization extends notably beyond the site's own remarkable engineering achievement, offering historians and archaeologists genuine insight into the kind of sophisticated, centralized political organization that Pacific Island societies proved capable of achieving, challenging older, now largely discredited assumptions that once treated Pacific Island cultures as inherently small-scale and politically simple, compared to larger, more heavily studied ancient civilizations elsewhere in the world. This older, now largely abandoned assumption shaped much of how outside scholars approached Pacific Island history for generations, treating monumental achievements like Nan Madol as anomalies requiring special explanation rather than as consistent, logical products of the same kind of political and organizational sophistication that produced comparable monuments elsewhere. A bias that Pacific archaeology as a discipline has worked deliberately to correct across recent decades, increasingly treating sites like Nan Madol not as exceptions proving a rule about Pacific Island limitation, but as clear evidence that the rule itself was simply wrong from the beginning. The Sorcerer dynasty's success in unifying an entire island under centralized political authority, and in mobilizing the kind of coordinated, sustained labor investment that monumental construction on this scale genuinely required, demonstrates a level of political and administrative sophistication that stands as a really significant achievement within the broader history of state formation anywhere in the world, regardless of the relatively small absolute population and geographic scale involved compared to larger continental civilizations more commonly emphasized in general historical education. Nan Madol's construction technique, the header and stretcher stacking method using naturally formed columnar basalt, represents a distinctive engineering solution developed specifically in response to the particular materials and environmental conditions available on Pohnpei. An example of independent technological innovation that owes nothing to outside influence or contact with other monumental building traditions elsewhere in the world, a reminder that sophisticated engineering solutions to the fundamental challenge of monumental construction have emerged independently, using locally available materials and locally developed techniques, in actually isolated cultural contexts scattered across many different regions of the ancient world. The site's continued spiritual and cultural relevance to contemporary Pohnpeian communities, discussed in earlier blocks, also offers a true valuable model for how archaeological research and heritage conservation can proceed in active, respectful partnership with descendant communities rather than treating local cultural and spiritual concerns as obstacles to overcome. A collaborative approach that researchers working at comparable archaeological sites in other parts of the world have increasingly looked to as a really instructive example worth studying and, where appropriate, adapting to their own local research and conservation contexts. The exact engineering challenge that Nan Madol's builders solved, moving and precisely stacking basalt columns weighing up to 50 tons using nothing but human labor, watercraft, and an evidently sophisticated practical understanding of tidal mechanics and load-bearing construction, deserves particular consideration alongside comparable monumental engineering achievements documented elsewhere in the ancient world, since the combination of constraints Pohnpeian builders worked within, no metal tools, no draft animals, no wheeled transport, construction occurring directly on a reef flat rather than solid ground, presented a distinctive set of practical problems that required equally distinctive solutions. Experimental archaeology conducted in recent decades, including attempts by researchers and local volunteers to replicate small-scale basalt transport using traditional raft-building techniques and materials available on Pohnpei today, has helped confirm the basic practical viability of the raft transport theory, demonstrating that lashed log rafts of achievable size and construction complexity could float columns of the documented weight across open water during appropriate tidal conditions. Though these experimental efforts have understandably worked with considerably smaller and lighter test columns than the largest specimens documented at the site itself, leaving open questions about exactly how the very heaviest 50-ton columns were specifically managed, even as the basic transport method for lighter material has been reasonably well confirmed through direct practical testing. Comparative analysis with other monumental stone construction traditions around the ancient Pacific and wider world reveals both true parallels and points of distinctive difference. The basic challenge of moving extremely heavy stone material across significant distances using only human and watercraft-based transport recurring at monumental construction sites scattered across many different ancient cultures, while the specific solution of building an entire settlement directly atop a coral reef, requiring foundational construction work simply to create stable, above-tide line building surfaces before any wall construction could even begin, appears to represent a genuinely unusual and distinctly Pohnpei-specific engineering approach without close parallel at comparable monumental sites documented elsewhere in the wider Pacific region. The precise labor organization required to sustain construction efforts of this scale across the multiple generations the full building program apparently required implies a really sophisticated system of resource mobilization, skilled labor coordination, and sustained political will maintained consistently across successive sorcerer rulers. Evidence that the dynasty's centralized political authority translated into effective practical administrative capacity, not merely symbolic or ceremonial power, but the kind of sustained, coordinated organizational capability that comparable monumental building projects anywhere in the ancient world required to actually succeed across the extended timescales involved. This kind of sustained, multi-generational labor coordination required successive sorcerer rulers to maintain and pass down not just political authority itself, but the actual practical administrative systems, methods for tracking which communities owed which specific quantities of labor or tribute at which specific points in the ongoing construction schedule, that made continuous progress on a building program spanning multiple royal generations true achievable, a level of institutional continuity that speaks to administrative sophistication far beyond what a purely ceremonial or symbolic dynasty could have realistically sustained across so many decades of uninterrupted major construction activity. What continues to actually puzzle researchers examining the site's full construction history is the question of exactly how skilled labor and construction knowledge itself was transmitted and maintained across the generations the building program spanned, since maintaining consistent construction technique, quality standards, and structural engineering knowledge across a project unfolding over centuries required some form of sustained institutional knowledge transmission that, like so much else about sorcerer-era Pohnpeian society, survives today primarily through oral tradition rather than any directly documented historical record of how master builders actually trained their successors. Ongoing research at Madol continues incorporating increasingly sophisticated archaeological and scientific methodology, including detailed geological sourcing studies that have helped researchers map the full network of quarry sites used across the construction program with much greater precision than earlier survey work achieved, along with expanding radiocarbon dating coverage that continues refining the specific chronological sequence of construction across different sections of the wider site. Drone-based aerial photography and photogrammetry, increasingly applied to the site in recent research campaigns, have allowed researchers to produce comprehensive three-dimensional documentation of Madol's full extent with a level of precision and completeness that ground-based survey methods alone struggle to achieve given the site's complex, water-crossed layout. This technology proving particularly valuable for monitoring the ongoing mangrove encroachment threat discussed in later blocks, allowing conservation teams to track vegetation growth and structural change across the entire site with a consistency that manual, periodic ground survey simply could not match. Underwater and coastal archaeological survey techniques, increasingly applied to Madol's exact reef-flat construction context in recent research campaigns, have begun revealing additional evidence about the site's original construction and use that purely land-based archaeological methods focused only on the currently visible above-water structures could not have fully captured, including evidence about ancient shoreline positions, submerged construction features, and the broader relationship between the built environment and the marine environment the site's builders worked within and around. Collaborative research partnerships between international archaeological teams and Pohnpeian cultural authorities and knowledge holders have continued deepening in recent years, reflecting a broader, welcome shift in how archaeological research at culturally and spiritually significant indigenous heritage sites around the world increasingly proceeds, prioritizing genuine partnership and knowledge sharing with descendant communities rather than the more purely extractive research models that characterized much earlier-era archaeological work at comparable sites during the colonial and immediate post-colonial periods. These evolving partnerships increasingly involve formal agreements governing exactly how research findings are shared, published, and credited, ensuring that Pohnpeian knowledge holders and local research collaborators receive appropriate recognition and involvement in how their own site's history gets presented to wider international academic and public audiences. A structural shift in research practice that stands in deliberate, pointed contrast to earlier historical patterns in which local knowledge was frequently absorbed into outside researchers' published work with minimal acknowledgement of its actual community origin. This evolving research approach has produced a considerably richer and more nuanced understanding of Nan Madol's full history than either purely archaeological analysis or purely oral tradition could have achieved working independently of each other, each source of evidence and knowledge helping researchers ask better, more genuinely informed questions of the other. A collaborative methodology that continues yielding new insight into exactly how this remarkable stone city was actually built, governed, and eventually transformed across the many centuries, separating its original construction from the ongoing conservation and research work happening at the site today. The specific conservation challenges Nan Madol currently faces connect to a broader pattern of low-lying coastal and island archaeological sites around the world increasingly threatened by the combined pressures of sea level rise, coastal erosion, and shifting local ecological conditions, meaning the site's exact preservation crisis, while really urgent in its own right, also functions as a kind of early warning example for comparable coastal heritage sites elsewhere that may face similar conservation pressures as global environmental conditions continue shifting in coming decades. Climate scientists studying sea level projections for the wider Western Pacific region have identified Pohnpei and comparable low-lying Micronesian islands as facing some of the more immediate practical exposure to rising water levels anywhere in the world, meaning Nan Madol's specific vulnerability is not an isolated archaeological concern but part of a much larger environmental challenge facing the entire Pohnpeian coastline and the communities who live along it, a context that makes the site's conservation crisis feel, to many people working on it, far more urgent and considerably more emotionally weighted than a comparable threat facing a heritage site in a region with less immediate, less personally felt exposure to the same underlying environmental changes. For many Pohnpeians directly involved in ongoing conservation efforts, protecting Nan Madol from rising seas has become intertwined with the broader, deeply personal challenge of protecting their own homes, farmland, and coastal communities from exactly the same encroaching water, meaning the site's specific fate has come to function, for many people living on Pohnpei today, as a kind of visible bellwether for the wider environmental future the entire island community now faces together. International conservation funding and technical support directed toward Nan Madol since its 2016 UNESCO designation has helped fund targeted mangrove management and structural stabilization work at priority locations across the site, though the overall scale of ongoing conservation need notably exceeds what current funding and local technical capacity can fully address, meaning the site's long-term physical survival remains, even with this increased international attention, a true uncertain proposition requiring sustained, ongoing investment rather than any single completed conservation intervention that might otherwise be considered a finished project. Funding cycles tied to international grant programs and heritage organization budgets rarely align cleanly with the kind of decades-long, uninterrupted conservation commitment a site facing threats as severe as active mangrove root infiltration and rising sea levels requires, meaning Pohnpeian heritage authorities must continually renew and re-justify funding applications even as the underlying environmental pressures facing the site continue unabated in the background, a structural funding challenge that affects threatened heritage sites in developing regions around the world more severely than it affects comparable sites in wealthier nations with more consistent access to sustained domestic conservation budgets. Pohnpeian heritage authorities have worked to balance the true practical necessity of increased conservation funding and international research collaboration against equally genuine concerns about maintaining appropriate local cultural control over how the site is studied, presented, and eventually developed for whatever level of tourism or public visitation local communities ultimately decide is appropriate. A balancing act that reflects the same broader tension between international heritage, interest and local community authority that affects indigenous heritage sites in many other parts of the world facing comparable conservation and development pressures. This balancing act has produced deliberate, considered limits on how aggressively Pohnpeian authorities have chosen to promote Nan Madol as a mass tourism destination, prioritizing sustainable, culturally appropriate visitation over the kind of rapid visitor growth that might generate short-term economic benefit, but that local heritage officials have judged would risk both physical damage to the fragile ruins and disruption to the ongoing spiritual and cultural practices that continue. Connecting the site to living Pohnpeian tradition. What makes Nan Madol's specific conservation situation actually distinctive within this broader global pattern is the site's continued living cultural and spiritual significance to the very communities most directly responsible for its ongoing stewardship. Meaning conservation decisions at the site cannot proceed as a purely technical or purely scientific exercise but must remain genuinely responsive to Pohnpeian cultural authority and spiritual protocol, a requirement that some outside conservation organizations have found really challenging to fully accommodate within their own typically more secular, purely scientific institutional frameworks and funding priorities. The organizations that have found this collaborative approach true successful, rather than merely tolerable, are generally the ones willing to treat local spiritual protocol not as an inconvenient constraint on efficient conservation work, but as itself a legitimate form of expertise about how to properly relate to and care for this particular place, an attitude shift that has, according to researchers who have worked at Nan Madol across multiple different institutional partnerships over the years, consistently produced better working relationships and, ultimately, better conservation outcomes than approaches that tried to minimize or work around local cultural requirements rather than building conservation planning around them from the very beginning. Tonight, the basalt columns of Nan Madol still rise directly from the shallow waters of the Pohnpei lagoon, still stacked in that same header and stretcher pattern that allowed builders working without mortar, without metal tools, and without wheeled transport to raise walls 8 meters high directly atop a living coral reef, a genuine engineering achievement that continues defying easy, complete explanation even after more than a century of dedicated archaeological attention from researchers. Working alongside the Pohnpeian communities whose own oral tradition preserved true, detailed memory of this place across all the centuries, separating its active use from its eventual documentation by outside observers. Somewhere out on that same shallow reef tonight, tide moving in and out through canals first cut by hands whose names no written record ever captured, the specific answer to exactly how the heaviest stones actually moved remains, in its full technical detail, still unresolved, one of the last remaining engineering mysteries of its kind anywhere in the Pacific, patient enough, like the reef itself, to wait for whoever eventually brings the right combination of curiosity and evidence to finally close the gap between what the stones prove was accomplished and what anyone today can fully explain about how the sorcerer dynasty that commissioned this remarkable city, and that eventually fell to Isoclekal's invasion after generations of increasingly harsh, increasingly exploitative rule, left behind no written record of its own, its entire history surviving instead through the patient, careful transmission of oral tradition passed from generation to generation of Pohnpeian storytellers and knowledge holders, a form of historical preservation that has, across the intervening centuries, proven remarkably consistent with what formal archaeological investigation has independently confirmed about the site's construction, its political organization, and its eventual transformation following the collapse of centralized sorcerer authority. What Nan Madol still faces today, mangrove roots slowly working their way into the gaps between ancient stacked columns, rising seas threatening a site built barely above current tide level, the practical difficulty of funding conservation work adequate to the scale of what this remarkable place actually requires, represents a considerably more immediate and much more solvable challenge than the mystery of exactly how these stones were originally moved and stacked, a conservation crisis that, unlike the deeper archaeological questions still surrounding the site's construction, depends primarily on sustained human attention and sustained human resources rather than any further breakthrough in understanding what actually happened here centuries ago. The stones themselves, patiently quarried and transported and stacked by builders whose individual names history never recorded, working within a political and religious system remembered today primarily through the careful oral tradition of their own descendants, continue standing exactly where those builders placed them, still holding their shape without a single drop of mortar, still rising directly from the same reef flat that first made this remarkable, unlikely city possible, waiting now for whatever combination of continued research, continued conservation investment, and continued respect for the living Pohnpeian tradition that has always been the true keeper of this place's real history, to determine how much longer these particular stones will still be standing here for anyone to see. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.